LGR's Talking Property is brought to you in association with the Kings Group, your local high street property business that delivers on results and service. We'll get you moving. The views and opinions expressed on LGR's Talking Property are those of the host, guests and contributors and are not necessarily those of London Greek Radio. While all facts, figures and statistics are carefully researched, listeners should check before taking any action based on information and advice offered in this programme. LGR's Talking Property with Karl Knipe.
Good evening and welcome to LGR's Talking Property, the monthly live discussion on all things property. Tonight we're asking the question, are landlords and the private rental sector under attack? In the last 2 years we've seen this government increase stamp duty for buy-to-let purchasers by 3%, taxation on profits has increased, and they've gradually chipped away at the tax relief for mortgage payments, among other things. And now the government looks set to act Section 21. This will mean that landlords will no longer be able to evict tenants at short notice unless they have good reason. What will this mean for the sector and landlords in particular? A Labour Party policy proposal is suggesting a return to the rent controls of the 1970s, and with the tenants fee ban about to come into operation on the 1st of June, landlords are being told their costs will rise further. Is it time to sell up and leave the sector? We want to hear from you this evening. Text us on 0737 661 1033 or message us on Twitter at LGR Talk Property to give us your view. What are your questions? What are your worries? Whether you're a tenant or a landlord, contact us. With me to discuss and debate and give their expert views and thoughts on all this this all-out attack on the private rental sector this evening are a panel of 4 highly knowledgeable guests with me. Our first guest this evening, tonight, is David Smith, Policy Director for the Residential Landlords Association and partner at Anthony Gold Solicitors. They specialise in residential landlord and tenant law. David is well known for his work on tenancy deposit protection, HMO and consumer protection legislation. He acts for clients needing specialist drafting of tenancy agreements, terms of business and other documents in relation to the complex landlord and tenant litigation. He also defends clients faced with prosecution for alleged breaches and consumer protection legislation. David is also a skilled and experienced mediator, offering advice on the law and practice of mediation, property, landlord and tenant boundary disputes. Welcome, David.
Thank you very much.
God, that's quite a long one.
That was a long introduction, yeah. Almost like I wrote it myself.
I think you probably did. Thanks for joining us this evening. Also with us this evening is Graham Rowan. Graham, in his own words, is a man on a mission. His goal is to help savvy investors and business owners achieve real financial independence. In recent years, his mission has seen him speak at the United Nations, no less, in New York, Harvard Business School in Boston, and both Houses of Parliament. Graham chairs the Elite Investor Club, a global network of over 1,500 sophisticated and high net worth investors in 10 countries. Elite Investor Club has been selected to appear in the 2019 Parliamentary Review in recognition of its leadership in the alternative investment field. Graham has published 2 books on investment and fronted 3 series on Sky TV, one being Make Your Money Work. He has over 9,000 subscribers to his YouTube channel, Elite Investor TV, and publishes a new video each week. So you take things easy then, Graham, yeah?
Yeah, in my spare time I appear on programmes like this, Carl. Thank you for having me.
Well, that's all right. Thank you for being here. Our third guest this evening is Danny Zane from My Property Group. Danny is chairperson also for the Association of Independent Inventory Clerks. Danny's been involved in the lettings industry since leaving university and followed this through by opening a highly successful property inventory company. My Property Inventories quickly became a leader within the industry across London, Hertfordshire, Essex, Bedfordshire, Bucks and Surrey. My Property Inventories work alongside local councils, letting agencies, including large chains such as Barnard Marcus, Cluttons, Connells, Countrywide, Belvoir, private landlords and important UK-based embassies. AIIC is the only body regulating independent inventory clerks in the UK. Danny is also a fully qualified commercial pilot, is a marathon runner and formerly a self-defence instructor. So I'll not be picking a fight with you tonight, Danny, that's for sure.
Thanks very much. Good evening.
Good evening. Lovely to have you with us. Completing the panel tonight is Andrew Boff. Andrew is the recently appointed Deputy Chair of the London Housing Association. Andrew lives in Barking, has been a councillor in Hillingdon between 1982 and 94, and Hackney between 2005 and 2006. Born in Hillingdon, he was leader of the council between 1990 and 1992, and while in Hackney, he helped run Broadway Market's Saturday Market and published a local magazine, up to being elected to the Assembly in 2008. Andrew ran his own IT support company. During his time on the Assembly, he has headed an investigation into housing overcrowding and published reports on violence against sex workers, housing on the Olympic site and end-of-life care. Fabulous that you can join us tonight, Andrew. Is this your first outing as Deputy Chair of the London Housing Assembly?
Funny enough, yes. I mean, but we had a meeting today, curiously enough, which was my initiation.
Oh, and you've made it here then?
Oh, I've made it here.
Oh, right, that's good.
Sat me straight away.
Oh, well, it's good. It's lovely having you all with us tonight. We want to hear from you, the listeners, this evening with your questions and comments. Please message us by text on 0737 66 11033 or contact us via Twitter at LGR Talk Property. That's messages on 0737 66 11033 or contact us via Twitter at LGR Talk Property. Let's hear what your questions are and what you want to hear. So straight in, David, if you could help us by explaining the benefits to our listeners of exactly what is a Section 21 and why it's so important to landlords.
Wow, there's a tough question. A Section 21 notice basically allows a landlord to end a tenancy at the end of whatever agreed fixed term the landlord and tenant have got to. So you can't use it if there's a contractual agreement running, without giving any specific reason, and then giving the tenant 2 months' notice to find somewhere else to live. It's sometimes called no fault eviction, but actually I think that's a bit of a misnomer. Over half of landlords actually use Section 21 with perfectly good reason, like rent arrears or antisocial behaviour. So I tend to call it no explanation eviction, in that the landlord doesn't have to explain the reasons to the tenant, even though they often have them. But it's certainly quite controversial at the moment.
Yeah. So what are the consequences if the government do in fact abolish this act, Graham, in your opinion?
Well, I think in a sense, you can't just look at this in isolation. You know, I mean, I'm sitting here with a.
Is that not what the government are doing though? It does appear that maybe they are looking at, or they're dealing with this in isolation.
Well,
that's the issue, isn't it?
I think we've had 8 housing ministers in 9 years, so the chances of this being a joined up policy with some thought behind it are fairly slim. But if you are a landlord, there are at least 23, 24 measures that have gone against you in the last 5 years. So I just see this as the latest in a long vendetta against private landlords. So it's in and of itself, what this will mean, obviously, is that potentially tenancies will go on much, much longer. If they're a perfect tenant, that's not necessarily a problem. But, as David said, sometimes there's reasons you need to be able to ask tenants to leave. And it's just one more thing for landlords to worry about.
Well, I think that's hence why the headline of the show is the private rental sector and landlords under attack, because the feedback that we've had from the listeners is that that's how they feel. Is that what the feedback you've had from? Totally.
And the reality is starting to be borne out by the numbers now. You know, there are tens of thousands of landlords leaving the sector. But it's interesting. It's slowly dawning on people, I think, particularly things like Section 24, which was the reduction in tax benefits on the finance costs of property. That's starting to hit people in the pocket now as that ramps up over the next 2 or 3 tax years. So they're starting to see properties that were reasonably profitable suddenly becoming unprofitable. And then their reaction is, oh my goodness, what's happening here? Maybe I need to change my plans. But, the smart ones saw this coming and have started taking action 2 or 3 years ago. But I think a lot of people, it's kind of creeping in from left field, and suddenly it's becoming apparent to them that something's wrong and they've got to start doing something.
So is it too late for them to take action?
I don't think it's too late. No, I think yesterday was better than today, and today's better than tomorrow. But I think the when you look at the things in aggregate, it's going to be much, much harder to make good, predictable income from buy-to-let residential property, I think, in the coming years. I think there are little niches where there'll still be some profits to be made, but for the average landlord who's perhaps just gradually assembled a portfolio of 4 or 5 properties over the years, they've got to stop and take stock of where they are and really think carefully about the future and what their strategy is going to be.
Yeah, well, that's one of the reasons why I wanted to put this out as a show, as a programme to our listeners, because I do know that in the community there's lots and lots of people who property's always been their thing. They own more than one property, and it's really important that they're aware of this. and they start asking the questions that's necessary and getting the right kind of expert help, really.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think one of the measures I use is that every year, twice in April and October, I speak at the London Property Investor Show. And you'd imagine people that go to something like that are sort of self-selecting of having some level of interest in property, perhaps above average. And every time I ask the room, typically about 60 people, how many of you have heard of, say, Section 24? And 2 years ago, maybe 1 or 2 hands went up. Most recently, maybe 7 or 8 hands go up in a room of 60 people. And this is such a fundamental impact on the profitability of your investment. And yet so few people seem to even know about that one, let alone Section 21 that we're talking about this evening.
Yeah, I think the lack of awareness point is a real problem. It's a great frustration for the RLA and for most other landlord organisations that landlords don't get engaged enough. It's very difficult to get landlords engaged in these things. And one of the reasons that we're so often getting beaten is that tenants are quite engaged. They're quite well engaged. Their organisations are able to pick up a lot of people to talk, but it's very difficult to get landlords to buy into these things and to put their voices forward, and so the voice isn't heard. And the reality is all of the landlord associations together have about 1% of the total number of landlords as members. That's microscopic. The average for a special interest organisation is around 20%. For an organisation serving a particular professional group, so it's crashingly low, and it is deeply problematic in terms of putting a voice forward.
Yeah. Danny, why have the government decided to take this action? Do you think? What's prompted it?
So clearly, the tenants in the UK make a huge proportion of voters. You have to win the tenants over to win the election, so to speak. So I think it's been a real focus for them to look at potentially, as some people might say, persecute the property owners, the landlords out there. Unfortunately, I don't know how on these things the tenants are going to end up as winners. Landlords are seemingly running for the hills already, and if this comes through and makes life even more difficult, then what's going to happen to the supply? Who is going to buy property anymore? Are the hedge funds going to run away from property investment as well? Supply is important.
Well, some say that's not a bad thing. That will keep prices low, maybe even bring prices down.
How so?
Well, if there's less demand for property, in theory...
But this is a misunderstanding. I hear this a lot. A lot of tenants groups say, oh, well, if you give property to first-time buyers, that means that there'll be less demand for tenanted property, and so things will all be fine. So if landlords start, it's
not
fine.
necessarily tenanted property, but just property prices would go down, wouldn't they?
Property prices drop. That has... And again, tenant groups say, oh, it'll be great, house prices will drop, everyone will be happy. What about all the people who have got mortgages, who have got help to buy schemes, who are screwed to the wall on a hard mortgage already, who will then be in negative equity? What about a property value underlies every element of our financial system, and if property prices start to drop drastically, then everybody will run from the hills, not just landlords.
Well, that's true. We've got a great question that's coming that I want to ask Andrew when we come back, but we're just going to go to a break.
You're listening to LGR's Talking Property.
Στις δύσκολες στιγμές που ακολουθούν την απώλεια ενός αγαπημένου προσώπου, εμπιστευτείτε το γραφείο κηδιών Δημητρίου and English. 30 χρόνια στην καρδιά της παροικίας. Έχουν την εμπειρία και αναλαμβάνουν με συνέπεια και επαγγελματισμό τη διοργάνωση της κηδείας του εκλειπώντος, καθώς και κάθε άλλης αναγκαίας πένθυμης τελετής ή ακόμη και τον επαναπατρισμό του αποβιώσαντος στον τόπο καταγωγής του. Και όλα αυτά σε ασυναγώνιστες τιμές. Και δεν είναι λόγια. Μπορούμε να συναγωνιστούμε οποιαδήποτε προσφορά. Τέλος, σας βοηθούμε στη συμπλήρωση των κατάλληλων εγγράφων και την κάλυψη των εξόδων κηδείας από το DSS. Δημητρίου and English. 30 χρόνια στο πλευρό της παροικίας. 888 99 888.
LGR's Talking Property with Karl Knipe.
Great to have you back. Right, straight in, Andrew. Just got a text in from a listener. Who's it? Chris that came in. What is wrong with this government that can't govern, and now they are yet again alienating their core voters, the hard-working, self-employed, thrifty voters? Chris, hashtag Farage 4PM. So, thanks, Chris, for texting that in. Andrew.
Obviously, the government's got problems at the moment on all sorts of issues, and I'm a bit surprised with it that it's decided to try and caricature landlords by looking at the worst examples of landlord-tenant relations and using that as the template for which they're then going to make policy. And I think the ending of Section 21, without providing any details as to how you're going to do that, for example, the government has to come up with some idea of assessing a good reason for ending a tenancy, and we don't know what those are at the moment. So they've announced the removal of Section 21, but they haven't said what's going to replace it. Now, it's out for consultation. People need to write in. Those very under-engaged, may I say, and I absolutely agree. You know, we have plenty of people coming to us on the London Assembly when we're doing investigations into the PRS, private rental sector. And I must say that we don't hear enough from landlords, and landlords have to become more engaged. They have to start replying to things like the consultation that's now open on the review of legislation. They must respond. The voice needs to be heard.
Well, it's notable actually that this does seem to have shaken things. The RLA has a survey running since just before the Easter weekend, so just over a week, and it's had 5,000 responses around the sector, which is more than we've ever had on anything.
Yeah.
And in just over a week and a half, it's including one of the hottest Easter weekends we've had for a number of years. That people actually spent Easter. Over 3,000 people on Easter answered this survey. When I would have thought they'd be happier out in the sunshine doing barbecues, but no, they responded, and I think this might finally have started to shake landlords into really understanding they must engage with what's happening to them.
Andrew said that they've announced the abolition of Section 21, but they've not announced what they're going to put in place. That, to me, seems very, what should we say? I was going to say something, but I better not say that. It just seems a very bizarre way of going about it. Surely you don't get rid of something until you know what's going to replace it with. Well,
perhaps they felt there wasn't enough uncertainty going on at the moment, so we needed something else that was a bit uncertain. But I think the key point I think I would make is that, and it's sort of linked to the engagement issue, one of the things I always kind of coach people within the investor club is you've got to own your own financial future. You've got to take personal responsibility. It doesn't matter, who else you might use as advisors and so on. No one else has got your financial well-being at the top of their agenda. So, I learned a very painful lesson when I had professional wealth managers who lost me a shed load of money. And at that point, I thought, hold on a minute, I should be in charge here. And I think part of being in charge of your financial future is keeping yourself educated on what's going on in the sector and how that's going to impact your portfolio. So very little of this is new. Section 21 is the latest in, I could list you 23 measures, but you have to see that I think there's a trend emerging here. This has become a political football, and the problem with political footballs is that politicians have to keep kicking them. And it all started about 5 years ago, somewhere in the back of George Osborne's mind. It became a crime to be a private landlord.
So you're just making me remember the old 80s spitting image at that point when you're saying somewhere in the back of his mind. I imagined him turning around and there being no back to his head. The Chancellor's brain is missing.
Yes. Well, when this tax came out, Section 24, the Daily Telegraph called it an Alice in Wonderland tax. Because in every other business in the world, you have revenue, then you take away your costs, and that gets you to taxable profit. With the Section 24, it was like revenue equals profit. So it turned everything on its head. That was the start of it, but there've been all these other measures since then, and so you have to say to yourself, is this suddenly going to get better in the future, or do I need to stop, reevaluate, and see whether there's something better to do with my money?
I think this is where we need to be honest. I mean, this is one of the problems with the current government is that they've started to demonise, as Andrew was right to say, they've started to demonise landlords and pointing to the very worst examples, which is a tiny minority of the relationships, as being the relationship. And they should be honest. The real problem here is, and I keep saying this, is that we don't have enough houses in the right places for people who can afford them. Okay. And government after government, it's not just the current government, there have been previous stripes of government as well, including multicoloured stripes, who have simply failed to build enough houses. We haven't met a house building target in England for over 10 years.
And we're not going to in the next few years.
No, and we aren't. For another 10 years, probably.
This is something we were talking about earlier. I mean, we've had how many housing ministers in the last 9 years? 8?
8.
Yet to me, this should be one of the singular most important ministerial jobs. that someone takes on board and has a proper plan. We're not just talking about a 5-year plan, a 20, 25-year plan. And successive governments, as you said, just haven't dealt with this issue.
And the seniority of the minister has changed. It's actually been on the cabinet. It's been off the cabinet. It's actually the minister hasn't just been a different housing minister. The nature of their role has altered, because sometimes they've been housing communities and local governments. Sometimes it's now housing communities and local government. Previously, it was just communities and local government. Previous to that, it stopped being a cabinet post for a while. So in fact, there's no consistency even in what the role of the minister actually is and how important they are in government.
It's not. I mean, the private rented sector has rapidly grown over recent years. There's more than 4 million people living in private rented accommodation. So this needs to be done carefully if they are going to make these changes or abolish Section 21. To ensure that the balance of the equality is not tipped too far, and in doing so, creating a landlord exodus.
I agree with you. The trouble is I think in government there isn't that they need to be reminded of the very important job that the private rental sector provides. I mean, some of London's most vulnerable people are being housed in private rental sector, and a lot of them very well, who are very well accommodated. And governments needs to be reminded that if you start tinkering with that sector, you're going to have fewer homes, fewer possibilities. Yes, at the heart of it is that we're not building enough homes and haven't done for probably around 30 years. The government is now, I think it's now started to realise that there's a record of, I can only speak about London, but there's a record amount of money now going into London, a record investment. The trouble is we've got Sadiq Khan spending that money, who's not doing it in a very good way, may I say. He's underperforming all the time. But they do suddenly realise that housing is important. And may I say this is quite recent, because 2 elections ago housing didn't feature at all
That's very true.
as the top of the list. It was crime, it was transport. Housing is a relatively new priority at elections in London.
It does seem to me as well, the problem with the PRS situation is that the PRS has consistently asked to do more and more and more. When we first started 30 years ago with the Housing Act 88, we were talking about a relatively small pool of people, and you've got more and more different groups being lumped into the private rented sector. The government's now asking private landlords to house people on benefits, very vulnerable people. We've got the new discussion, which is elderly people in the private rented sector.
Yeah.
And I think at some level we should be saying, is the private rented sector the most suitable place for all of these different groups? It's unrealistic to expect that the private rented sector is going to be the best accommodation opportunity for every different type of tenant. Different types of tenants need different things. And some of those, and we should perhaps rethink where we choose to put people in terms of private and social housing, and select the housing opportunity that meets somebody's needs better.
Yeah, I think that's, from a government perspective, that's true. But in terms of the people listening to us who are wondering what to do with their own portfolio, I think the challenge is, who knows what's coming next. I mean, in a sense, you could have this kind of pincer movement where, on the one hand, you've got the removal of Section 21, meaning you can't end the tenancy. Virtually the only thing now left to bring in is rent controls, as you mentioned up front, Karl. So you can imagine where suddenly the government's telling you how much you can charge and you can't get rid of the tenant. At that point, your private property portfolio has suddenly entered the non-profit charity sector, and you're providing a public service at your own expense, So you've got to be very careful that you can get sucked into a situation where what you thought was an investment that was going to keep you in your old age and be your retirement income has suddenly become a liability.
I think I'll have to defend the government slightly here and say I don't really see that there's going to be a time where the private renter sector is not a good investment. I've already met with the government off the back of the Section 21 announcement. They're pretty adamant they're not intending to do rent control, and I'll get back to rent control in a second. They're pretty adamant that they are intending to produce new housing courts and Section 8 alternatives and things, and they are alive to some of the issues created by getting rid of Section 21. So I think it would be wrong, and I've certainly had landlords saying to me, should I get rid of all my tenants immediately and serve them Section 21 out because I might not be able to? And I say, well, let's not rush into anything just yet. But certainly we should be alive to the risks, but let's not immediately say the world is ended.
Okay, when we come back, Danny, I'll leave you this one, I think, for the break. Are there any advantages with getting rid of Section 21, abolishing it?
Kings Group has been in the high street for nearly 30 years. Agreeing a sale on your property is the easy part. Ensuring it completes and you move is the hard part in today's market. That's why we're here with you every step of the way, and there's no upfront fee. At Kings Group, we are local property experts with a proven track record. Kings have won over 50 Estes Awards for customer service, voted for by you, the public. We have also been awarded the FIFO Gold Service 2018 Award for outstanding service. Voted again by our satisfied clients, we are motivated to move you with the minimum fuss in the quickest possible time, while ensuring you are given the personal customer service and advice you deserve. Kings Group, with branch offices across North London, East London, Hertfordshire and Essex. Kings Group offer a special discount of 20% to LGR listeners off all our standard fees. Simply mention LGR's Talking Property for further information. Please call on 01707 872 000 or visit www.kings-group.net. Kings Group, you only pay on results, not promises.
LGR's Talking Property with Karl Knipe.
Danny, great to have everybody back. So, are there any advantages to the abolition of Section 21?
The one that I can see the clearest would be the elderly, vulnerable families that want stability, long-term tenancies, knowing that they can be put in a property or put themselves in a property and actually have the rights to remain there for a long duration without firstly the revenge evictions, but of course without just the landlord decides I want to move on with this and do something else or refurb the property.
So, are we taking a what should we say, a very large stick to bash this with, really, by abolishing Section 21? Surely, rather than abolish it, there could be some changes to it.
Huge change.
You could still, come up with those
I would
benefits.
disagree with that. I think one of the problems we've actually had with Section 21 is the government's actually put us in the worst of both worlds at the moment. There are so many weird restrictions on Section 21 now. There are problems around gas safety certificates in Section 21, which the government didn't even anticipate and which are now heading for the Court of Appeal, which obviously is great for lawyers, but not great for anybody else. So I think
very good for you, David.
It's good for me on that one, yeah. But the difficulty, I think, is that the government it's silly to have stupid restrictions that cease to make it work effectively. If you're going to have Section 21, it needs to work effectively. Otherwise, don't have it and have something else that works effectively. The problem we've now got is the government's introduced a lot of random restrictions on Section 21. One option is to introduce another series of random restrictions. That seems a bit bonkers. The other option is that you get rid of Section 21 and put something effective in its place without too many random restrictions. And I think if the government is determined to get rid of Section 21, then that other thing is what we need to have. That the question is whether we'll get it and how good it will be. And if it's done properly, I don't see that's automatically a disaster. But my concern is, will it be done properly?
There's an awful lot of work that needs to be done before we can have a bill to present to Parliament. For example, there's lots of charities that are providing temporary accommodation to vulnerable people.
Yeah.
And in order to provide that temporary, sometimes hostelry type accommodation, they have to have fixed term contracts. They're going to be destroyed by the end of Section 21 because they're not going to be willing to say somebody like Centrepoint in London, who's providing accommodation. They know that their accommodation can only really be used for 2 years. Otherwise, they're not doing their job, because the aspiration for that vulnerable person is that they then go on and find their own accommodation. Well, they're going to be put out of business by this unless they bring in some kind of exception. So I don't think the government really has thought this out. No. I think they've said we want to end Section 21 because it wants to appeal to the tenants who are out there. But there's very little going on.
And the trouble with exceptions is everyone then wants an exception, and you have too many, and you're back to where you started.
But there's one thing I wanted to pick you up on, David. You said the government is adamant that it's not going to have rent control. Well, that's true. The government is. The opposition, however, is adamant that it will. Absolutely will have rent control. Now, this is a departure because under the previous Labour government, they realised that actually rent control was a daft idea and actually reduced supply, and it actually meant the rent goes up. I mean, perversely, but we all know those arguments.
The problem here is that rent
so they're committed to it, and that really worries me.
Yeah, and that worries me too. And I think part of the problem here is that unfortunately people use rent control to talk about 4 or 5 utterly different things. So people are already talking about rent control in relation to getting rid of Section 21, but what they really mean is avoiding situations where landlords artificially push rent up by 1,000%.
Well, that's not going to happen though anyway, is it? Because it's all a marketplace.
But in fact, there's already law that's in place. There's case law that says you just can't do that. So it's already covered. Or you can talk about rent control in the classic Rent Act 1977. The government's fingers are completely on the scales, and they say this is what you can charge. Clearly a very bad idea, and we've got quite a lot of historic evidence that it probably doesn't work. There's quite a lot of evidence from around the world, and particularly in the United States, it's a very bad idea. In fact, it does terrible things like, for example, reducing housing mobility. So one of my objections to, for example, the Mayor's idea of rent control for London is all of the evidence in the United States is that if you have localised rent control, you actually damage all of the places around the area with rent control that don't have rent control because you reduce housing mobility. And then the other option is you have a Berlin type model where you have rent stability, is what I tend to call it, where rents go up by, say, RPI plus 1 inside a tenancy, but then are free floating between. The downside of that, of course, is what you in fact do is you drag all rents up by RPI plus 1 every single year. And the truth is, in London, rents don't in fact go up by RPI plus 1 every single year.
I do, if you don't mind. I mean, people always mention Germany. Germany hasn't got a housing crisis. We, nothing that we would recognise as a housing crisis. And we did a little review on the London Assembly a few years back on rent control.
Yeah.
And we had Christine Whitehead, who's the expert in the London School of Economics in housing. And she actually agreed with the statement. She said rent control only works where you don't need it.
But to be fair,
and that's precisely the German situation.
Using Germany as an example, at this very moment, there's a serious discussion going on in Berlin about the forcible confiscation of properties from big landlords. Yeah. So that goes even beyond rent controls. They're actually seriously discussing in the local authority.
Trying to copy Europe's mistake. And again, the other reason that rent control is a bit of an odd idea is you go and look at Scotland, technically has rent pressure zones, and they haven't introduced any. Edinburgh's talked about it for over 18 months, and it's quietly disappeared because there's no good reason to do it. And I think I agree with you. I think the problem with rent control is that it means a lot of different things to different people. And in practice, its negative effects are probably greater than its positives.
I think there's an article by Mark Schaffman in the Property Eye, the online magazine, on 29th April this year. Zoopla there warned against rent controls becoming policy. They cautioned against the use of rent controls, a Labour Party proposal, as we've already said, as research by the portal suggests that rents track earnings over the long run and adjust when affordability becomes stretched. Analysis of the website's rental listings found that at a national level, rents have ranged, and there's obviously arguments for London and places like that, but analysis of the website's rental listings found that at a national level, rents had ranged between 28 and 32% of average earnings since 2007. The current proportion of earnings spent on rent is 30%, Zoopla's analysis found. So what's the problem, Danny? Is there a problem?
Not to my knowledge. It's in some areas, parts of London, for example, rents can be deemed as very high, and I'm sure that ratio will be above 30% of earnings.
Of course.
But this is a
national
problem isolated to some small areas in our city.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely. On a national level, I can't see an issue. The issue I do see again is what I said earlier about Section 21 and it being abolished. Landlords will run for the hills. The supplies will dry up. It's creating a problem, or it's giving a solution that's going to create further problems in the long term.
And can I just bring another angle to this? Again, coming back to the listeners and their potential, portfolio that they're sitting on.
Yeah.
A lot of buy-to-let investors that I speak to, particularly in London, have convinced themselves that it doesn't matter too much about the month-to-month cash flow being all that positive, because of course the capital values are going to go up so much, aren't they? And that was true for many years, and people often are, people who've been in this game a long time are often sitting on a large capital gain. But if you come into the market now in 2019, what's the capital gain going to be like in the next 10 years? I think we're in a very soft market. I'm not suggesting there's going to be a crash or anything like that, but I do think it's going to be a very soft market with very low gains. So unless you're making, the cash flow positive side of the rental investment, you're not going to be rescued by capital gains.
But that's really interesting. We just got a text come in that said, I'm totally confused. Should I sell my 5 buy-to-lets built up over many years for my retirement, buy another, or what else?
Well, I can only speak for myself. I personally have sold my residential buy-to-let portfolio
You
the
have,
last
yeah.
couple of years. Yes, I'm completely out of residential.
So what
buy-to-let.
areas are you investing through, presumably the Elite Club?
Yeah, we're going to more commercial things like, for example, dementia care homes, which we have nearly 1 million people.
So
living
you
with
buying
dementia.
those as a group?
We're buying individual suites within a care home,
Right.
Leasing them back to the operator and getting a completely passive income of typically 8 to 10% from that for anything
Okay.
up to 25 years. Boutique hotels are another a model where we're looking at, because there's a big tourism boom going on. One of the
Yeah.
benefits of Brexit has been lower pound, more foreign visitors. So we do things like hotels, theme parks, stuff like that. And for the higher net worth investors, there's a whole bunch of private equity for property developments, bonds and loan notes and things as well. So there are lots of things where you can get your money working for you in a much more, frankly, passive way than buy to let. Because usually most buy-to-let landlords say to me, "Oh, I've got passive income, I've got residential buy-to-let," and then I only do about 25 hours a week looking after them.
Yeah.
So I look for things that are genuinely passive, and also I just felt that the lie of the land was clear. The government was against private landlords. That's not going to change all of a sudden. So I just thought I'll get out early on rather than leaving it too late.
No, I think it's a problem. A lot of landlords don't do their maths properly. RLA research shows that the majority of landlords don't factor in their time when factoring their profits. They say,
Yep.
we've made this, but
Time is money.
Yeah, you've spent all this time on it. You could have made more money by working somewhere else. And then also, as a lawyer, I see so many landlords who come through the door to me and say, my rent's not being paid, I can't afford to pay the mortgage if the rent's not paid. And my response to that is, well, sorry, the court can't do anything about that. And really, that wasn't actually a very sensible business plan.
But doesn't that bring up an interesting thing in the context of Section 21, which is that if landlords get into difficulty and perhaps can't pay the mortgage, but they also can't get rid of the tenant, what about the lenders in that situation?
Yeah,
What are they gonna
This
do?
is
They can't
something. I mean,
repossess
the lenders have stayed very quiet on this, haven't they? Because I mean, that's a major scenario. Some of the lenders have been saying you've not been allowed to put people on housing benefit into properties. They've backtracked from that. But I think this is an even bigger issue if you're not going to be able to gain possession of the property.
Will they lend on the buy-to-let?
Well, I don't think they'd want to, but they're backtracked on the housing benefits situation where the government's lend on them. So who's to say they won't backtrack on that as well? But certainly, I think that there'll be a much smaller appetite for lending where you've got less control. Without
And
doubt.
of course, the potential is that lenders will take a much more robust attitude. In practice, many lenders are relatively generous to buy-to-let landlords. They often give them up to 3 months mortgage arrears, which they don't have to do, but they give them essentially the same allowance they give to homeowners, and they just might stop being so kind, in effect, or kind. I mean, not that kind, but they don't need to do what they're doing, and they might be much more robust.
I wanted to bring something up with Andrew that he said. I know this Conservative government's got through Parliament more socialist policies than any Labour administration since the Attlee government just after the Second World War. But surely they wouldn't go for rent controls as popular as it might be.
No, they would not go.
They do like a bit of popularity, though.
They do.
They need it.
A politician likes popularity shot.
I'm hoping that in announcing the popular to tenants abolition of Section 21, that the details of any legislation that comes forward will fill the gaps. But that's why it's important that the voices of the landlords are heard and that government listens. And I'll certainly be letting them know that this is a mistake that they're doing. But if they're insistent and carrying on with the abolition of Section 21, then they've got to put something into place that provides the kind of certainty for landlords so that they will continue to provide the homes that Londoners need.
Theresa May said she's really wanting to focus on the jams, and she's just about managing to hang on as Prime Minister at the moment. I think she wants to reduce private landlords to the jams as well. Yeah.
It seems to me to be carelessly short term, though, because the reality is we all know that getting rid of Section 21 doesn't create houses. So what do you say to tenants in 4 or 5 years' time when you've got rid of Section 21 but nothing's changed? And you say, oh, sorry, that one didn't work. What are we going to do now? So there's always this problem, it seems to me, that the government is promising, or even worse, the current government promises that you change a party leader and a different party leader who's from the more right-wing side of the Conservative Party says, oh no, we're not actually doing that. So they've actually seemed to me to back themselves into an appalling corner with the people whose votes they seem to want to court.
This is the same thing, in my opinion, that's happened with the tenant fee ban. Rents will start to go up. That money's going to hit the tenants somewhere. It may not be in their pocket as an admin fee at the beginning, but it's shown in Scotland rents rise when you ban the fees, and it's a way of getting that money back, and tenants aren't going to benefit from it.
We're going to go to an ad break. When we do, I'm going to come back onto that and ask you another couple of questions on tenants' fee bans.
You're listening to LGR's Talking Property.
Η Alpha Cleaning Services είναι μια εταιρεία εμπιστοσύνης με πείρα μεγαλύτερη των 10 χρόνων στην παροικία που προσφέρει υπηρεσίες γενικού καθαρισμού σε γραφεία, επιχειρήσεις και σχολεία.
Ειδικεύεται στον καθαρισμό των χαλιών. Υπογράφοντας συμβόλαιο διάρκειας 1 έτους, έχετε εντελώς δωρεάν τον καθαρισμό των χαλιών σας. Παίρνετε έκπτωση 10% αναφέροντας το London Greek Radio.
Η Alpha Cleaning Services καλύπτει επίσης και περιοχές εκτός Λονδίνου καθώς και άλλες πόλεις. Alpha Cleaning Services.
Για πληροφορίες καλέστε Βόρειο Λονδίνο 0203 295 8888 ή 079 1788 6700. Για το Νότιο Λονδίνο καλέστε 0203 295 8889.
LGR's Talking Property with Karl Knipe.
Welcome back. Theresa May said everyone renting in the private sector has the right to feel secure in their homes, settled in the community and able to plan for the future with confidence. But millions of responsible tenants could still be uprooted by their landlord with little notice and often little justification. This is wrong, and today we're acting by preventing these unfair evictions. Landlords will still be able to end tenancies where they have legitimate reasons to do so, but they will no longer be able to unexpectedly evict families with only 8 weeks' notice. This important step will not only protect tenants from unethical behaviour, but also give them the long-term certainty and peace of mind they deserve. Surely any fair-minded individual wouldn't have a problem with that, Graham, would they?
Yeah, right. Well, I think it's important that people who are in the position of being a landlord think about their tenants, and I think the vast majority of them do. I mean, I was speaking just recently to one of our members who runs a lot of HMOs in his houses of multiple occupancy, mainly for youngish professionals. And he said, I'm seriously considering selling up because of the impact of all these measures, but I just don't know where my tenants would go, So anything that's going to make landlords less and less inclined to stay in the sector is going to start impacting people in ways like this. So I think in some ways, when you start... when politicians start meddling in markets like this, there are always unintended consequences. We've heard of some of them already talking about the fees and so on. And I think there'll be a lot of unintended consequences from this. And I can't see it actually helping. As David said, it's not going to create more houses. It's only going to create more unexpected consequences, which will lead to more uncertainty, which will lead to more landlords leaving the sector and fewer rental properties being available.
Landlords and tenants, let's hear from you. Please text us on 0737 66 11033 or contact us via Twitter at LGR Talk Property. It's important. Got 10 minutes, get your question in. On that point, I've got a question here. Does this mean if my tenant is, say, 6 weeks in arrears, I will not be able to evict them? Surely not. Chris, it's not the same Chris, it's a different Chris. Who'd like to answer that one?
Well, you can evict tenants who are 6 weeks in arrears now. It's just more difficult because it's a discretionary ground for possession. It's up to the court rather than being a mandatory ground. And this, of course, is part of the big question as to what the legislation's going to look like.
Because part of this issue as well is obviously with the changes in housing benefit and everything else that's in there, we're finding more and more tenants are getting 4, 5, 6 weeks in arrears and then struggling to actually make those payments down.
And this is a perfect example of unintended consequences. Universal credit in principle looks like a great idea.
Yep.
Make tenants responsible for the money that's given to them by the state. But then a lot of those tenants don't have the right sets of skills. No one's trying to teach them those skills. Many of those people will never acquire those skills and they're too vulnerable. But you just chuck the money at them anyway and then let them sort it out. All the evidence shows that universal credit has increased rent arrears for social landlords, for private landlords, for everybody. And they've gone up by a significant amount. And that falls hardest on the private sector who are smaller. And the government isn't thinking through these kind of things. And this happens again and again and again across the whole. The Tenant Fees Act creates a whole load of unintended consequences. Getting rid of Section 21 creates unintended consequences. And these all come home to roost in the end. And this is why obviously government should regulate the sector, but at the moment the government is doing knee-jerk regulation off the back of headlines on pages, and obviously I would say this as a lawyer, but that is not the way you make law.
It's regulating bits of the sector from time to time. It's not regulating the industry, though, is it? Is that not an issue?
Yeah, we need to regulate landlords, regulate their properties, give them unique IDs, make sure they comply, and regulate the agents that draw up the agreements and actually handle, all the money and the tenancies themselves.
I think that's true, but I think one of the things I see across the whole investment sector, not just in property, is that there's an increasing willingness to regulate, and we have more regulators and regulations than we've ever had at any time in all of human history. But never do I hear the likes of the FCA or any of the regulatory bodies around property say, I know what's a good idea, let's give more financial education to the people so they can make smarter decisions themselves. So, I think for me, we don't learn this stuff in school or university or in the workplace.
No,
there is
not at
no
all.
place where we actually are taught how to manage money, how to save, how to invest, and so on. And there's a fundamental...
And this is the flaw of Section 21. If tenants don't know about their rights, they won't exercise them. The reality is, even after Section 21 is banned, there will still be landlords who will give effective Section 21 notices to their tenants, and those tenants will leave the properties. And because enforcement is underfunded, no one will ever follow up on those effectively unlawful evictions. And the reality now is that there are lots of regulations affecting the sector, but actually most local authorities, who are the frontline regulators, aren't properly funded to regulate. RLA research has shown that nearly half of local authorities in London have never prosecuted a landlord. So either all of their landlords are perfect, which even I find hard to believe,
Yes.
and I'm supposed to speak for them, or alternatively, they aren't using the powers they've got. So
I think you're right. I mean, it's not as though tenants are having a wonderful time all over London. There are some tenants who are having a real struggle with some poor landlords.
Definitely.
And our group has recommended that one of the things we should be doing is looking at fixed penalty notices that the local authorities can issue against landlords, for example, who have not attended to the fact that there's no hot water running, or that the heating's gone, or that there's or those basic fundamentals of having a safe home, that they should be able to issue fixed penalty notices, which would then fund their service.
But this is one of the ironies.
But this is the kind of thing the kind of thinking we do have to look at, is helping those people who are really in need, not tarring everyone with the same brush, and assuming that every single landlord.
This again is a good example of the weak regulatory model. The government has created civil penalties for specific things, and a number of local authorities are issuing civil penalties. Again, RLA research is showing that none of those civil penalties have in fact been collected.
Yeah.
Most local authorities who are issuing civil penalties have not in fact collected the money.
Well, actually, if you look around London, you can see a huge variation in the number of the work of local authorities, those who take it seriously and those who don't. The trouble is, what they've done is they've said all we need is more regulation. So landlord licensing has been put in because, of course, and there's this feeling like landlord licensing solves problems. It doesn't solve any problems whatsoever. It just is another thing that landlords have to cope with, and another thing they have to pay. What it is, landlord licensing and the register of landlords is just a register of honest people. The dishonest people who are providing accommodation don't put their names on that list.
No.
But the fear factor also gets ramped up because we're now talking about, I think, £30,000 fines for first offences and unlimited fines for second offences for whatever you get. If you get classed as a rogue landlord, and it's fairly vague at the moment what that definition would be, it's another kind of thing that makes you think, do I want to stay in this sector?
And you have local authorities going after the low-hanging fruit. I've just taken on a new client. He's got cancer. He's dying, and it's not the first time I've seen this, and he's being prosecuted for not having a property licence through a genuine error. And you've got local authorities who are prosecuting, and I've seen this 2 or 3 times, people who have genuinely made a mistake, who no reasonable person would prosecute, but they're an easy target. It's much easier to prosecute someone who you've noticed, who's an easy prosecution, than go out and invest money, time and energy in actually finding those rogue landlords who, of course, aren't going to sign up for licensing schemes, and whose tenants have been told not to talk to the local authority, or they're out, and who aren't paying their council tax, who aren't paying their income taxes, and all the other stuff that they're not doing. People who break the law in one place break it across the board, and there is nowhere near enough time and energy and money being invested in catching those people and driving them out the sector.
Yeah.
Well, it's a little bit. I thought this was interesting. Government data itself shows that on average tenants live in their rental properties for over 4 years, and that in 90% of cases tenancies are ended by the tenant rather than the landlord. Have we got any thoughts on that? I mean, again, if that's the case, why are we getting rid of Section 21?
I think particularly in London, you have a very transient population. They move around between jobs, they move here to work for a period of time if they come from abroad or whatever. So you are going to get a lot of movement that is, to suit the lifestyle demands of the tenants. That's absolutely true. So it doesn't surprise me. But I think again, I come back to unintended consequences, and what we should be doing is trying to increase choices for tenants, but also not doing that at the expense of tying in landlords to situations that could become financially intolerable for them. So it is, as you say, it needs a lot of careful thought before the legislation is finalised.
And this, again, I think comes back to some unintended consequences. If we have, for example, Andrew rightly talked about the need to have exceptions for specific types of tenancy. If you get lots of exceptions and then every landlord's taking advantage of those exceptions,
yes,
you might in fact end up reducing the average time that someone's in a property and flip it around. Tenants won't be choosing to leave. They'll be booted out because landlords will want to take advantage of whatever exception they've had available before they get stuck into a tenancy that goes on and on.
I think the important thing to remember is that it's best not to despair now. We've got a long way to go before this legislation is in place, and I think the lesson we've got to learn is to raise your voice and let yourself be heard.
I think what landlords are worried about is and certainly the lettings market is worried about. This was done where tenants' fee bans has come into play comes into play from the first, and obviously, like anything, because there wasn't the right legislation, this was being exploited. But it seems madness that there is no tenant fee at all for taking on tenants or whatever. It would be sensible there'd been a limit of say 200 or 250 or 150 or whatever, but to have nothing, I think, is going to create a lot of issues and problems, and in my opinion, I think will, over a period of time, put rents up. I don't know what you think, Danny.
No, absolutely.
I know landlords have been told this, and there are a lot of them are worried about it.
It did the same in Scotland, and they've run in and they've created this act, and I don't think they've given it much thought at all. It's a vote rig. Let's be pro-tenant and offer them some something interesting. But there's all sorts of troubles with it. If you're a contractor and you turn up to a property and the tenant has had the appointment made with them in writing and on the phone, and they haven't showed up, you're not going to be able to get your money for your call out. That sounds ridiculous to me.
Yeah.
And that's just one of the unintended consequences for our organisation in independent inventories. We're now being sidelined by some agents and landlords due to lack of money or another way to make more money. So again, we're the second most protective document in a tenancy. This is a big unintended consequence and an issue.
Okay. Gentlemen, we've had a stimulating, passionate and educational programme this evening. Before we leave the listeners, is there anything that you could give them a good tip? David, what tip would you give them?
I would have to say, join a landlord association, make sure you know the legislation that applies to what you're doing.
Danny?
Tenant, landlord and good letting agent out there, use a regulated unbiased inventory report for all your tenancies. Make sure you've got one in place.
Graham?
Take a fresh look at your portfolio, see how it's going to look under the new rules and the new tax rules, and whether it's still going to be profitable or not, and whether it's going to achieve your long-term financial goals anymore.
Andrew?
Write to your members of parliament, your local councillors, your assembly members, and remind them you're providing a service that Londoners need.
Thank you very much. We want to hear from you as to what subjects you'd like Talking Property to feature over the coming months. Please text us on 0737 66 11033 or tweet us at LGR Talk Property with your views and thoughts. If there's anything that we can help you with, just let us know. Remember, it's your show. So all that remains is to thank you, gentlemen, the guests this evening, David, Graham, Danny and Andrew, for their time, their thoughts and their expert opinions. I'll leave you with the words of that Monty Python classic song, always look on the bright side of life. We're back Wednesday the 5th of June at the same time. Till then, take care, enjoy life and be good. Goodbye for now, or Kello Varavi.
LGR's Talking Property was brought to you in association with the Kings Group, your local high street property business that delivers on results and service. We'll get you moving. The views and opinions expressed on LGR's Talking Property are those of the host, guests and contributors and are not necessarily those of London Greek Radio. While all facts, figures and statistics are carefully researched, listeners should check before taking any action based on information and advice offered in this programme. LGR's Talking Property is presented by Karl Knipe and produced by London Greek Radio.